Hello, Colorado Realtors. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Legal Bites, another in the continuing, ongoing series, the saga, really. I mean, this is like Breaking Bad. You guys are probably like hanging on, for Netflix updates. Breaking Bad. What's another big, Monica, what's another big series that everybody? Shogun. Oh my goodness, Monica just dated herself there. Shogun. That predates Netflix. You're hanging on for these series of 2022 new contract changes. And I'm working through, I don't know how many there'll ultimately be. I think this is the third in the series. And I'm just taking a new provision from the contract to buy and sell that I've had repeated or really good questions on. I know there's a little bit of confusion, and I'm trying to address it in a Legal Bite. So stay tuned for more of these things. Inspection contingencies is another area that changed substantively effective January 1st this year. And I want to just talk you through some thinking on that or behind those changes and give you some insight into maybe how to handle some things. So as you guys probably recall, who have been in the business for more than 3 years now, the contract used to just be inspection objection and inspection resolution. There were only two contingencies related to inspection. Embedded within inspection objection was inspection termination. So they were always the same date or deadline. And you could do one or the other prior to that date or deadline. And then 3 years ago when the contracts changed, they got pulled out. Inspection termination got bifurcated or separated from objection. And so then you had three inspection deadlines: termination, objection, and resolution. You still have those three deadlines, but in the old contract, what it said was under inspection termination deadline is that inspection termination deadline needed to be the earlier of the deadline or the inspection resolution deadline. And so that enabled brokers to set, on a Monday is objection, and on Friday in the contract was termination and resolution, okay? That was leading to some earnest money disputes and some bad faith allegations and some contractual frustration between the parties. And so I won't get into the reasons behind all of that, but essentially what's occurred now in the new contract is that the inspection termination deadline has been backed up. And so now it has to be the earlier of inspection objection or termination. Okay? Now, let me explain a little bit of a nuance to that to make sure that you guys understand and you don't mess this up. What the new contract says is that once a buyer has delivered an inspection objection, they can no longer take advantage of the inspection termination deadline. And the termination is only the affirmative right to terminate. It's not the total lockdown on the contract. It's just the buyer's affirmative right to terminate is what the termination deadline is. So let me put this into practice. Let's say that from a practical standpoint, as you're a buyer writing an offer and as you're a seller or listing broker receiving an offer, you ought to be probably just lining up inspection termination and inspection objection ought to be the same date or deadline. So let's say that you've got Monday is inspection objection and inspection termination, and Friday is inspection resolution. The buyer has up until Monday to terminate the contract unless for some reason the buyer, let's say the buyer on Saturday, 2 days early, delivers an inspection objection to the seller, saying, I'd like you to resolve these things, here's my objection. In that case, even though Monday is the termination deadline, and that's still 2 days out, as soon as the buyer delivers that objection document to the seller, they have cut off their ability to affirmatively send over a termination. So that essentially moves then that inspection termination deadline that was Monday up to Saturday, because upon delivery of that objection, the buyer's right to send a termination thereafter is done and no longer exists. And that's an important piece to understand, because the deadline in some cases may not actually be the deadline that's articulated in the dates and deadlines chart for that. So be cautious of that. The point of the change really is to make sure that buyers, if they're issuing an inspection objection, that they're giving the sellers the time to actually resolve the objection and to respond prior to the resolution deadline. And that was part of the earnest money issues that we were, or dispute issues that we were starting to see is that a buyer would deliver an objection, and then a couple days later they'd deliver a termination because they still had the right to do that. Well, sellers get frustrated by that because they start interviewing contractors, trying to get estimates to figure out how much it's going to cost them to resolve the inspection items. And then when they turn around and end up with an inspection termination or a termination from the buyer, they get frustrated with the buyer. So this change is meant to cut that off. I want to point out, though, the only reason that we didn't essentially move the inspection objection and termination deadlines back into just one contingency was because you can still use, and I believe it's valuable in some cases, to use the inspection termination deadline all by itself. If you're a listing broker and you've got a seller who's saying, I don't want to do anything to this property, this contract is as is, I'm not going to receive any objections, I'm not going to resolve anything, this is it. This price that I'm giving them, the condition of the property, it is what it is, I don't want to do anything. I would encourage a listing broker then to counter an offer from a buyer, removing inspection objection, removing inspection termination, removing inspection objection and removing inspection resolution, and only maintaining inspection termination deadline. What that essentially is saying to the buyer is, listen buyer, you have up until this date or deadline to investigate the property, do whatever you'd like to do, bring in all the experts and inspectors and anybody else you care to, and on or before this date, you're either in the contract or you're out of the contract. That's it. You're going to terminate or you're going to move on and not going to ask for any inspection items. So the inspection termination deadline can be used by itself, and I think that is an important thing to preserve. But do understand with the new contract, once your buyer delivers an inspection objection, they can no longer affirmatively send over an inspection termination document. Now, I get a lot of questions when people hear that from realtors that say, well, wait a second. Does that mean if they object, they have no right to ever get out of the contract based on inspection? No, that's not true, because remember, the inspection resolution deadline still says that once a buyer issues an inspection objection, one of two things has to happen. Either the buyer in writing withdraws their objection before the resolution deadline, or the buyer and seller both sign a resolution or other amend extend to resolve the inspection issues prior to the resolution deadline. If one of those two things doesn't happen, contract dies at the time of day deadline on the resolution day. So that would terminate the contract. Now, if you're in a situation, and the last thing I want to point out here, where your buyer gives an inspection objection and for whatever reason things just aren't coming together on the resolution, the buyer finally says, you know what, our resolution deadline isn't until Friday, but let's say it's Wednesday, and the buyer says, I just want out, this is not going to get done, we're not going to get this inspection resolved. At that point, you can now use the earnest money release form, which was updated. And if you just fill out the earnest money release form, have your buyer sign it, there's a box now that you can check that says if the parties check this box, they're acknowledging that they are not releasing each other from the contract or from additional claims and liability to each other. Okay, so if your buyer just fills out an earnest money release form, does not check that box that reserves rights or preserves the existence of the contract, they send that earnest money release over to the seller. Once the seller signs the earnest money release form, it terminates the contract. The contract is dead as well, so there's no need to do any termination. And I think that's effective to put a seller essentially on notice as the buyer to say, listen, we're not going to get this inspection resolved. I know we technically have until Friday in our resolution deadline, but most sellers are going to receive that earnest money release that terminates the contract now and releases the parties from any other obligations and say, here's my choices. I'm either going to sign this, terminate the contract, release the earnest money presumably back to the buyer, or I'm going to spend the next couple of days remaining under contract and just have to wait for the contract at the time of day deadline on Friday to terminate on the inspection resolution. And I think that most sellers are going to say, I'd rather just sign this darn thing now, give the buyer their earnest money back, and move forward, get the property back on the market immediately, and save myself a couple of days of marketing time going forward. So I think that's how it will play out with the earnest money release. But that is now available to a buyer who says, for whatever reason, you know, this inspection objection that I've given is just not going to get resolved before the resolution deadline. So that's another way to handle that. And anyhow, that's the nuance and changes to the inspection contingencies. Please do keep in mind that important substantive change that upon the delivery of the objection, there's no more affirmative right to terminate, even if the deadline is after the delivery of the objection. So keep that in mind. Make sure your buyers understand that. If you have more questions about any of this, feel free to call the legal hotline. We always love hearing from you there, and can talk through any other contract questions that you might have. We'll see you again on the next edition of Legal Bites.